Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? My name is Chris Beam. I'm the Managing Director of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. It was up on the screen, but I want to just say one more time thank you to our co-sponsors for this event, the Humanities Institute, the Center for Character, Conscience, and Public Purpose, the Donald P. Belisario College for Communications, and the School for International Affairs. We're grateful to all of them for their partnership. I also want to take one moment, it was also up on the slide, but I want to take one moment to tell you about another event coming this semester. On Tuesday, November 12th, journalist Hedrick Smith will be here to present and answer questions about his documentary, Winning Back Our Democracy. The film looks at how citizens are fighting back against democratic erosion at the state level. So we also already have a couple of really terrific speakers lined up for the spring that you will want to know about. And so if you haven't done it already, I would encourage you to sign up for our listserv and sign up for us on social media. The way to do that is to go to our website, democracy.psu.edu. There's no one in this room that can walk out without remembering that. democracy.psu.edu. Okay. All right. Anyway, and finally, if you've been here to events that we've had before, you know the drill. Those mics will be for questions and answers after the talk, and we'll go either or, and we'll get as many as we can. Okay, so around here, I don't bring it up very much, but I went to Notre Dame. And and when I was there, in the circles I ran in anyway, it was big news that the new editor of the New Republic was Catholic. And so the conversation continued on from that point. Wait, he's how old? Wait, he's conservative? Wait, he's gay? It was very confusing, but we all worked through it, and I think that recollection is a good metaphor for Andrew Sullivan's work. The man spurns categories and accordingly swims in controversy. As a result, aside from perhaps from his dogs and his immediate family, I don't think there's anybody who always agrees with Andrew Sullivan. But I have found, and if you know his work, I think you will have found as well, that it is when you disagree with him that he is especially worth reading. That was true with the New Republic, that was true with The Dish, and I think that's true now with New York Magazine. It is just not particularly important to Sullivan whether his point of view conforms to your expectations. Rather, his writings reflect an honest and forthright effort to wrestle with the facts of the day. Having done that, he is content to let the partisan chips fall where they may. Just so, he clearly welcomes the opportunity to debate with anyone who is similarly motivated. Now, we would love to tell you that our bringing Sullivan here at this pivotal moment in our democracy was the result of the exquisite prescience of the McCourtney Institute staff and faculty. But that's just not true. It's mostly dumb luck. But, dumb luck or no, it is our great good fortune to have him here right now. So please join me in welcoming Andrew Sullivan to Penn State.
Thank you so much. Everybody hear me okay? Just one small correction. My husband and my dogs despise everything I say and do. I have beagles which never obey anybody. But thank you so much for that very generous introduction. What a day to come here. What a week. What a topic. How to get my arms around it. I'm going to do it in three parts if I can. The first is a look at this moment in the history of democracy and the theory of democracy and see where it fits from 3,000 feet up. And then I want to look at how this particular moment in time and in history has also a very important point to make about what is going on. And thirdly, I want to talk about the individual who is at the center of this crisis of democracy right now, Donald Trump, and what he represents and who he is. And then to speculate a little bit about the future, and then to have a conversation with you all, I hope, about that future. Democracy hasn't always been a good word. We think of it almost banal as obviously something that is good and important, a vital value. And one of the good things about a liberal education is that you get to read people from other eras and other ages. And it always struck me that when I was reading and invited to read Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics, they didn't like democracy very much. And they had an understanding of democracy as something that's deeply unstable. The one thing they all agreed on, and the one thing they agreed on with the founders who studied them, was that democracies are fragile. And they do not last very long, and have not lasted in history very long. Liberal democracy, our particular version of democracy, has only existed for a tiny sliver of history, like maybe 200 years if you're really pushing it. And the entire rest of human history and culture has actually not been democratic. So why did Plato believe that democracies are unstable? Well, it's quite simple, really. Democracies are defined by a radical belief in equality. Equality of all kinds, equality in power, equality in ideas, equality in ways of life. Plato called it a multicolored cloak, full with many hues. He also said that if you had to pick of all the different kind of regimes to live in, and those are a monarchy, an aristocracy or an oligarchy, or democracy, you would always pick democracy. Because it's lovely living in a democracy. No one really bosses you around. Different ideas are constantly around. Equality extends throughout the culture. This is the culture in which teachers defer to students, in which there is no difference whatsoever between men and women, and they're taken to be interchangeable. That's what equality really means. It's where the government is actually filled, and the office is filled, entirely by lottery, a really random sprinkling of the democratic society. And democracy is pleasant and has many appetites. Democracy is defined really by our letting our desires overtake our reason. So democracies tend to be full of wealth and greed and lust and food and all the things that we use to make ourselves feel better, even though we know back in our heads maybe it's not so great. And out of this extraordinary diversity of views, after a while, something begins to happen. Little inequalities begin to emerge, and people fight against them. Ways of life in some quarters become incompatible with other ways of life. Views are not just simply varied, but contradictory. And in such a democracy also at the same time, the wealthy essentially accept that they can't rule anymore. So what they're going to do is make lots of money. They're going to put their own private wealth and private interests above any interest in the public good. And the public good is to be looked after only insofar as it helps maintain their ability to make money. And of course, in a democracy, those who are making money, those who have more status of money than others, come under withering criticism from below. This is a varied, diverse, equal, thriving, but cacophonous place, with few restraints on its appetites, full of resentment of others doing better, pathologically devoted to the fundamental equality of absolutely every single person. And Plato says, when that begins to happen, when in fact these views and the diversity of people within this republic, all equal, not having power of each other, there tends to be gridlock, deadlock. These values are not compatible. How do we resolve these conflicts? And there also becomes resentment increasing of the wealthy, the people that somehow seem, through material goods, to be above this egalitarianism. And at that time, Plato says, usually something happens. Someone emerges, usually from the elites, who is full of the democratic temperament, full of desires, lacking self-control, pathological about food, constantly seeking sex, who realizes he has a moment. And the moment is for him to become a traitor to his own class, to actually accuse his fellow members of the elite of being corrupt, of being having too much authority and power, and violating the core principles of democracy. And if he finds, and this is Plato's words, a particularly obedient mob in that broad democracy, he can appeal to the people and say to the people, this chaos that you're living in, this constant deadlock of ideas and values, we can't go on like this. Nothing gets done. Nothing gets decided. And then he makes the argument that the wealthy and the elites are actually preventing those things getting done as well. And they need to be brought down. And he, as a member of elites, knows how to bring these people down. He knows the system. All he seeks is your mass support to take them down. Sounds a little familiar, but it's something that Plato says always happens in a democratic society. It can't really, in the end, govern itself, and in the end, it decides and gives itself up to a tyrant. And this is the only way tyranny comes about. When Plato and Aristotle talk about the changing of regimes, how kings can become tyrants, how, even though they tend to operate in the opposite direction, how aristocracies can become oligarchies, he's also aware that tyranny itself, popular, really powerful tyranny, comes from democracies and democracies alone. The founders understood this very well, in fact, obsessed about it. How, they wondered, could they get a democracy that actually worked, that wasn't short-lived, that didn't collapse under the weight of its own divisions? So they created what they believed to be a mixed regime with elements of democracy, elements of aristocracy, and even elements of monarchy in it. So that all these things can keep each other in balance and the thing has more stability. The core is the democratic will, but is always tempered by elites, by structures, by institutions, by rules that slow the democratic will down, that give elites a chance to get into the process. And by any historical measures, they were incredibly successful. This is the longest-running democratic experiment, explicitly as such, since the Roman Republic collapsed, as we know it did after a while. And it's this sense that democracies will always end in tyranny that informs someone like Ben Franklin's famous quip when asked what they had managed to do at the Constitutional Convention, and said, "A republic, if you can keep it." I think that helps us understand more generally the very broad shifts that are occurring in our society. Our democracy is relentlessly and increasingly democratic. We abhor and despise differences and inequalities of all kinds. We don't like restraints on the popular will. We don't even like any more constraints upon publication. Everyone has their own Twitter feed. Everyone has their own Facebook page. And we're doing this and arriving at this, what I would call late-stage democracy, at a particular moment in history and in time. Let me explain what I mean by that. In many ways, this has been a long time coming. You can see it, first of all, in the very structural divides of American society. The paradox of the great success of America is that it's become the victim of its own success. By success, I mean the extraordinary post-war, post-Second World War program to educate most Americans in a way they had never been educated before, to go out there and to find the young and the able and the intelligent and bring them into mass education for the first time, along with those who were being demobbed from the war, to create a really universally informed populace that would then go on to college to finesse their skills and run the society with their abilities. And it worked quite brilliantly. It was like they had a sieve that went through all of America to find the smartest and the most able people and brought them into higher education, unleashing so much talent and ability and wealth and growth at the same time. But at the same time, who was left behind? And at the same time, did those people go back to where they came from? Or were they quite comfortable in their big colleges and their major urban centers, where they got to live and be with each other and sustain a highly intelligent and cultured and multicultural way of life? So increasingly over time, these two Americas began to differentiate from themselves. What we might call the cognitive elite and those who are the rest of America. The divide between the college-educated and the non-college educated, which is at this point one of the strongest predictors of politics and culture in this society. And what we were creating was two countries that really were in danger of not even knowing each other or understanding each other. And we also created technologies that allowed us, through social media, to talk only to ourselves, so that the shutting off of the other part of America became even more complete. At the same time, those who were not college educated were enduring a shift of an economy that was really quite remarkable. Globalization, free trade, and technology, altogether three massive forces in the world economy, came in and slowly made it so much more lucrative to be a nerd in this society, gave the cognitive elite a massive advantage over everybody else, and rendered the value of unskilled labor, the basic stuff that most Americans use, educated or not educated, to get ahead, to build their lives, and be part of this great project of America. Those people, the people in that situation, have not had a pay raise really since the end of the 1970s. Meanwhile, the growth unleashed by the global trading environment, bringing China into the WTO, and also the rewards of a global market, especially in technology, funneled all the wealth right into the cognitive elite, and increasingly to the very top of the cognitive elite. The benefits of this globally were massive. We have seen the greatest rise in living standards for people in the developing world that we've ever seen. Massive reductions in poverty, child mortality. In many ways, globalization is a huge success. But there was one group in the society that didn't, and that was the non-college educated. They knew, and they know, the worst thing you can find out about yourself, that you're not needed anymore. Machines can do what you used to do. The world is global, not local. Your wages will never go up. Even those who used to have lower paid but meaningful work, people who made things, welders, builders, construction workers, people who did tangible things in their community and were rewarded and had status for that, had that slowly stripped away, as well as their financial stability. And then the Great Recession came in 2008, and it looked even worse. And as they recovered, and as the country recovered, they stayed exactly where they were, and every banker in the country just went back to their bonuses, and the shift of resources to the very top 1% or even 10% of the society became even more intense. At the same time, you had an extraordinary experiment in mass migration in the world. So while all this is taking place in a late-stage democracy, you also had the biggest influx of non-citizens into the United States in history, numerically. We now have something close to 14% of the country as foreign-born. I'm one of them. I am not anti-immigrant at all. I've lived that immigration dream. But the truth is that those people were often of very different culture, different race, different language. Yes, they could be integrated the way America always integrates, but there was a very great deal of them, and they were coming into unskilled labor, increasing the pool of labor, which meant they could be paid less, and the stagnation of the white working classes or the non-white working classes was deepened. And the vast majority of this immigration was actually not done according to the law. This is a recipe, obviously, for resentment. Beleaguered by the elites, suddenly being replaced by other people, seeing your country change dramatically in its demographic composition. It's not just in the US either. If you look at Europe and you see the mass migration from the South into Western Europe, you see very similar patterns. In the United Kingdom, for example, which is going through a similar crisis as we are here, mass immigration has altered politics there overwhelmingly. In 1 year, in 2015, more people gross immigrated into the UK than immigrated between 1066 and 1950. Almost 40% of the population of London wasn't born in the United Kingdom. And that's happened in like 20 years. Of course you're going to have a response to this, a reaction to this, and a fear of this. At the same time, we've also seen a collapse in things that used to give ordinary people meaning. You see a collapse in functional Christianity. Secularism spreading everywhere, especially among the young. And even among those who do call themselves religious and are, it has become less and less a force of meaning in the universe and the world than a cultural identification or a political position. And so when disaster hits, or when crisis looms, a lot of people find they don't have that old religion to fall back on. The reassurance, the community, the values that gave their lives some meaning. And so you get increasing bewilderment, higher levels of depression. Since the turn of the century, really significant increases in suicides and massive increases in deaths of despair, and a vast opioid epidemic in which many of the people caught in this trap are numbing themselves into some form of escape. I don't need to tell you this. It's everywhere around us. And all this begins to combine to create a sense of beleaguerment and of alienation from the other prosperous America. A sense of cultural isolation as well. You can see this in all those people who have honestly gone out and talked to Trump voters, regular people out there. This is what they're feeling, that their identity, the meaning of their lives, is somehow under threat. It's not just about whether they're getting a higher wage or not, but the place they have in the society and the culture. When was the last time you saw a sitcom about a white working class family? You look on cable and it's all fashionable, hip, multicultural images. And that's great. And we should be very proud of what we've done in our big cities and our metropolitan areas in terms of managing to manage this extraordinary explosion in diversity and multiculturalism. But elsewhere, it's not so happy. Within that context, a figure who emerges, who says, "I hear you," when no one else had really said that, is going to have a huge advantage. When he speaks the same way as most people speak, sometimes with the same pejoratives. When he spells the way people spell. And when people criticize that spelling, what do his supporters hear? They hear themselves being criticized. They have, at this point, identified with this figure. That's different than agreeing with him or supporting him. He is them. The facts don't really matter, because in this divided country where you feel like there are two countries and you are really being left behind, this is the one guy that seemed to emerge that talked your language and addressed your concerns. So, the philosophy of late-stage democracy leads to tyranny. The particular forces that have been shaping our particular moment in human history have made a very ripe and fertile ground for the ability of someone to come along and do that. The collapse of old authoritative institutions that would have prevented this democratic upsurge, like party elites who would have said in the old days, "Forget it, you're not even a Democrat. You can't run for our nomination. Or we'll decide at the convention and the elites will have as much to say as the ordinary people." Now that's all gone. And so we come to this actual particular figure. I'm persuaded through reading and study that history is often about big forces that I've talked about. It's also about human nature, which is, I believe, a permanent feature, and that the ancients were grappling with and understanding what monarchy and oligarchy and aristocracy and democracy was really about. But this guy, and as an individual, can also change history. History is not just these forces, it's also those that come along or are thrown up by circumstance or moment or chance, who exploit that moment and do so very well. And I think one of the things that has been underestimated about Donald J. Trump is his extraordinary demagogic ability. This is what transformed what was a fertile ground for him into a triumphal march. Those first rallies, carried, thankfully, by CNN live, endlessly, it's worth watching them again. It's worth watching them now. This is the first president that does as many campaign rallies in government as in a campaign. Because he's smart and he knows exactly what he's doing, like all good demagogues and salesmen do. Tell a story directly to the people, appeal to them, be on their side, find an enemy, mainly the elites or the immigrants, these people that have been, as I said before, have been part of the alienation of Middle America. Tell them he gets them. Use rhetoric brilliantly. Evolve over time by listening to the crowd, by assessing its responses, and learning over time to press certain buttons that no other politician in liberal democracy ever really wants to press. a man who came from no political context whatsoever, first time ever in this country, no even awareness of our constitutional system, not even understanding of the role of the president within that system. And also, as well as being a brilliant demagogue, being psychologically extremely ill. And I'm not saying this as a joke, even though people laugh at it. He is an absolute case study in what's called malignant narcissism. He sees nothing outside of himself and his own interests, and never has. It's quite rare to have no appreciation of other people's desires, views, feelings that might conflict with yours. He is a zero-sum person. Everything, he either wins or he loses. Every interaction is zero-sum. That's why he doesn't understand trade. He literally has no concept of what it is, which is, you sell me something, I'll sell you something back, we both gain. Great. We're both better off. It's a non-zero-sum interaction. He cannot understand that. He wants to know who won in that exchange. Who got the better deal? Who won? He can't understand why someone in a political system like a liberal democracy might stand up and say, I disagree with you and I want to stop this. He can't understand that as a useful part, in fact, an integral part of a democratic process that usually it has in history led to better results. No, it is an attack on him personally. And because he then adopts this pathological position of zero-sum, he also conveys that and instills that in his own support, who also begin to see nothing as non-zero-sum and everything as zero-sum. And so tribalism becomes very powerful in the country. And he is not a president, he is a tribal leader. It does not enter his mind, and has never, how to become president of all the people, including those who voted against him. And in some ways you think, what a tragedy that is. Could you imagine if he'd started off by saying, first off we're going to do infrastructure. And now we're going to give you all a big middle-class tax cut. And now we're going to do some tough free trade negotiations. And we're going to find a way to actually restrict illegal immigration with the Democrats by allowing a path to citizenship for everyone. He could be striding the political world like a colossus right now if he had been smart enough to do the things that even people like Steve Bannon proposed to him. And other leaders elsewhere have more successfully deployed. Instead, his only legacy is a massive tax cut to the very wealthy and a big tax hike on most people through tariffs. The opposite of what he promised. On top of this, we have what we have turned the presidency of the United States into. The founders never contemplated a presidency with this much power. Let's take him out of the equation and look at Obama. Think of the powers the executive branch now has compared to, say, the legislative branch. Since the Cold War, we've given that president power alone to end life on earth as we know it. The legislature, the Senate, the Congress have constantly deferred foreign policy to the executive. He has the ability, if he wanted to invade every individual citizen's privacy to an extraordinary degree through the technology that government now wields. All initiatives in our public policy tend to come from the president, not the legislature. And at the same time, we have had a theory since the 1970s, really, in conservative intellectual thought about what's called the unitary executive, which gives far more power to the executive branch in control of its own functionaries, with no actual check from outside than ever before. In other words, the judiciary has become, under conservative guidance, more and more subservient to the executive, less and less willing to check the executive. And the condition and criterion for every judge appointed in this administration has been only one thing that's really truly consistent, and that is the executive can do no wrong. It is not our role to check the president. And so we have this particular disturbed individual in a bloated and overpowerful executive branch, connected with, umbilically, in its identity, with around 30% of the country. It is not, and we are not living in a liberal democracy. We are living in a weird situation in which we kind of have a pseudo-monarchy within a constitutional framework, and in which the only thing that really matters is him. He tells us that all the time. And unfortunately, we kind of true. He enforces this in a way that no previous president has, with daily, hourly, minute-by-minute communication of an extreme tribalizing and polarizing intent, a very high emotionalism. It's all about feeling. Tribalism is also about feeling. It's about your identity, who you are. He's brilliant understanding that. And our culture also, because of social media, because of the internet, has allowed everybody to express their feelings powerfully and not in front of anybody actually else, to a screen where it's so much easier to say crazy things, and where other crazy people can back you up in your crazy things. And so over time, the public discourse becomes this complete cacophony of feeling and emotion and anger and resentment and fury. And of course, the paradox of this is that the opposition to him in some ways has no way to respond to him except by mirroring him. So the left has been pushed further and further into the very pole position where they're actually less popular in some respects. And presidential candidates on the Democratic side are constantly talking about as if they are going to be elected dictator for 4 years. Kamala Harris saying if Congress does not pass gun control laws, she will act after 30 days and go confiscate them herself. Completely unconstitutional. So where do we go? He has several things in his favor. There is really no, so far, discernible collapse in his core 30% support. That's enough to prevent the Senate convicting him, even if he were found guilty plainly of an impeachable offense, which I think is true. Here's the level of his hold on the base. A poll came out yesterday that showed that 40% of Republicans do not believe he mentioned Biden on the phone call with Prime Minister Zelensky, even though he has admitted it, even though it is in the plain transcript, even though it is in the whistleblower complaint. So you could, again, he said it himself, I could shoot someone dead on Fifth Avenue and they would not move at all. That someone with his psyche and temperament knows that is an extraordinarily frightening idea. And the other thing that's true, and I'll leave you on this very positive note, is that the tyrannical psyche is not linear. It's not static. It's dynamic. Each breach of a norm instantly becomes the baseline for the next one. And we are constantly in fear because he keeps us in that fear, that he will break every norm if he has to. No previous president has ever said, maybe I won't quit if I lose an election. No one has ever said, maybe I'll have 3 terms or 4 terms. Repeatedly. He said even in the last campaign that he might not respect the result if he lost, because millions of illegals have voted against him. He is currently calling a constitutional exercise called impeachment, that is perfectly within the constitutional order, a coup against him. And he is at war with most of the agencies of the US government. Cabinet government is done, over with. The idea that these federal agencies have autonomous leaders or have any accountability is completely gone. That's why he likes acting secretaries so much, because they're there only for a temporary period. And every single one of them has to obey him completely. And over the last 2.5 years, like all tyrants, slowly the dissenters have been weeded out, weeded out, weeded out. The incentive structure is in there that the only people who survive this are the most obsequious, the most obedient, in following someone who has no idea of the Constitution and who his own Secretary of State said persistently asked him to break the law every day. So we are in, and have been actually in, an emergency for quite a while. That the greatest mistake is to underestimate that crisis and emergency. He has never backed down, never conceded anything in his life. He will lie and lie and lie rather than actually allow reality to damage his own psyche. And the thing about impeachment, with the facts of impeachment and discussion of it, is that it really is bringing the reality into conflict with his psyche. He believes a certain thing. There's a deep state attempt from the beginning to spy on me and to get me, and I'm now going to use my Justice Department to get at Obama and Clinton once again, and I am going... All these things in his head that you have to really watch Sean Hannity repeatedly to even begin to understand. Reveal a man capable of doing anything to protect his psyche. And the closer reality comes to confronting him, the more angry he will become, and the more vicious, and the more inflamed. Usually in countries with very powerful emotional currents going through them, including this country in the past, when racial tensions or social tensions are at a peak, in every particular instance before now, the President of the United States has understood his responsibility, even though he's on one side of the debate, say, to tell people to calm down, to respect the rule of law, to tone their rhetoric, to realize we're all in this together, we're all Americans. We can hash these things out, the process works. He actually will further inflame the emotions and the passions. He, again, has no idea of the role of the presidency in sustaining the entire republic. A presidency that will be glad to hand on to another person. Which brings me to the final point, which is that I do not believe, and I know this will seem crazy, but interesting to see Tom Edsall in the New York Times today visit it. I don't think he will leave this office voluntarily, even if he loses an election. He cannot comprehend a repudiation of what he regards as his own identity. He may go, but we'll have to exercise quite extraordinary force to do it. But my fear is that he won't, and that a re-election is more likely than not. And if we follow... I'm sorry. Well, I'm just describing it. I'm not supporting it. Just trying to get real here. I don't currently see a candidate capable of taking him down at this point, I'm afraid to say. And with that joyful note, I will invite you all to come back at me and ask some questions. Thank you.